3 seconds. The defense systems had completely collapsed. Enemy missiles were approaching. Chaos reigned in the command center. While everyone was screaming, a 19-year-old rookie soldier whom no one had noticed did what everyone said was impossible. He pressed a single button, and the entire battlefield changed. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing to hear more tales of extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. NATO's Cyber Defense Command in Norfolk, Virginia, Private First Class Daniel Chun had occupied the same corner desk for 6 months, while other soldiers clustered around the central workstations, arguing over algorithms and displaying their certifications like badges of honor. Daniel kept to himself in what everyone called the rookie corner. The morning of March 15th began like any other. The massive underground facility hummed with the constant whir of servers and the soft clicking of keyboards. Banks of monitors displayed real-time threat assessments from around the globe, their blue glow casting an otherworldly light across the faces of the cyber warriors stationed there. Daniel arrived at 0600 hours, 30 minutes before his shift officially began. This had become his routine, arriving early, staying late, always present but rarely acknowledged. His workstation consisted of a standard-issue terminal that other soldiers mockingly referred to as ancient hardware, though it was only 3 years old. "Morning, computer boy," called out Sergeant Rodriguez from across the room. The nickname wasn't meant kindly. At 19, Daniel was the youngest member of the team, fresh out of technical training with test scores that had raised eyebrows but real-world experience that remained unproven. Staff Sergeant Williams, the section leader, barely glanced up from his triple monitor setup. Williams commanded respect through volume and authority, his voice carrying across the facility whenever he wanted to make a point. "Chun, run diagnostics on the backup servers. Make sure you don't break anything." Daniel nodded silently, pulling up the diagnostic protocols. Around him, conversations continued as if he weren't there. The other cyber specialists discussed weekend plans, complained about their assignments, and shared war stories from previous postings. Daniel listened while he worked, absorbing every technical detail mentioned, but rarely contributing to the discussions. "Kid doesn't say much," observed Corporal Martinez, settling into his workstation nearby. "You think he actually knows what he's doing? Or did they just need bodies?" "Test scores don't lie," replied Specialist Anderson, though his tone suggested skepticism. "But tests and real crisis situations are two different things. We'll see what happens when something actually goes wrong." The facility operated under constant tension. Every day brought new threats: state-sponsored hackers probing for weaknesses, criminal organizations launching sophisticated attacks, terrorist groups attempting to infiltrate critical infrastructure. The cyber warriors stationed there stood as the first line of defense against digital warfare that could cripple entire nations. Daniel's fingers moved steadily across his keyboard, running the requested diagnostics while simultaneously monitoring threat feeds on a secondary screen. His supervisor had assigned him routine maintenance tasks, the kind of work typically given to new arrivals while they proved themselves worthy of more complex responsibilities. But Daniel saw patterns others missed. While running backup server diagnostics, he noticed anomalous traffic patterns in the network logs. Tiny inconsistencies that appeared random but followed a subtle mathematical progression. He made note of these observations in a personal log file, though he doubted anyone would be interested in the theories of the section's youngest member. The morning progressed with typical cyber defense rhythm. Alerts flashed on screens, analysts investigated potential threats that usually turned out to be false alarms or minor probes, and the massive digital shield protecting military networks continued its invisible work. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the facility's commanding officer, made her daily rounds at 1,000 hours. A veteran of both traditional and cyber warfare, she commanded the respect of every person under her command. When she approached Daniel's workstation, he immediately stood at attention. "At ease, Private Chun," she said, reviewing his work logs on the screen. "How are you adapting to the operational environment?" "Very well, ma'am," Daniel replied. "I'm learning something new every day." Mitchell nodded, though her expression suggested she was evaluating more than his words. "Your technical training scores were exceptional. But remember, what we do here isn't theoretical. Lives depend on our ability to detect and neutralize threats before they can cause real harm. Understood, ma'am. After she moved on, Daniel returned to his work with renewed focus. He understood the weight of responsibility that came with defending critical infrastructure. Every system he monitored, every diagnostic he ran, every anomaly he investigated could potentially save lives or prevent catastrophic damage. The facility's main threat board displayed a global map peppered with red indicators showing active cyber attacks in progress. Most were routine attempts that automated systems handled without human intervention. But experienced analysts knew how to spot the unusual patterns that indicated something more serious developing. 1,400 hours, the anomalous traffic patterns Daniel had noticed earlier began intensifying. What had started as barely detectable inconsistencies were growing into recognizable signatures of coordinated activity. Still, the patterns remained subtle enough that the main detection systems weren't flagging them as threats. Daniel pulled up advanced analysis tools, running deeper investigations into the suspicious traffic. The data suggested multiple entry points being tested simultaneously, but with timing intervals that mimicked legitimate network maintenance activities. It was sophisticated camouflage that would fool most automated detection systems. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Daniel called out, breaking his usual silence. "I'm seeing some unusual patterns in the European theater networks." Rodriguez glanced over without much interest. "Define unusual, rookie." Coordinated probing attempts disguised as routine maintenance traffic. Multiple entry points being tested with intervals designed to avoid triggering automatic alerts. "Let me see," Rodriguez said, walking over to Daniel's workstation. He studied the data for several minutes, his expression growing more serious. This could be preliminary reconnaissance for a larger operation. Word spread quickly through the facility. Staff Sergeant Williams gathered his team around Daniel's workstation, reviewing the analysis while senior technicians verified the findings. What Daniel had detected was indeed the early stages of what appeared to be a major coordinated attack. "Good catch, Chen," Williams acknowledged grudgingly. "But identifying the problem is just the beginning. Now we need to figure out who's behind it and what they're really after." The next few hours transformed the facility's atmosphere from routine vigilance to heightened alert status. Intelligence analysts worked to identify the attack source while technical teams prepared defensive countermeasures. Daniel found himself included in discussions that had previously been limited to senior personnel. As evening approached, the attack scope became clearer. Multiple state-sponsored hacking groups were coordinating their efforts, targeting critical infrastructure across NATO member nations. Power grids, communication networks, financial systems, and military command structures were all being probed for vulnerabilities. "This isn't random," observed Colonel Mitchell during an emergency briefing. "Someone is mapping our entire defensive network, looking for the weakest points to exploit during a coordinated assault." The facility's defensive posture shifted to maximum readiness. Additional personnel were called in, backup systems were activated, and communication channels with partner agencies were secured. Daniel remained at his workstation, now monitoring multiple data streams while senior analysts prepared response strategies. But as midnight approached, the probing attacks suddenly intensified. What had been subtle reconnaissance transformed into aggressive penetration attempts. Automated defenses engaged, but the attackers had clearly learned from their earlier probing and were adapting their methods in real time. "They're testing our response capabilities," realized Specialist Anderson, watching attack patterns shift as defenses activated. "This whole reconnaissance phase was designed to map our defensive protocols." Staff Sergeant Williams coordinated the response from the central command station, deploying countermeasures and adjusting defensive parameters as attack vectors evolved. But the sophistication of the assault suggested months or even years of preparation by highly skilled adversaries. Daniel continued monitoring his assigned sectors while absorbing every aspect of the unfolding cyber battle. He watched senior specialists implement defensive strategies, noted which countermeasures proved effective, and began forming theories about the attacker's ultimate objectives. The young soldier's analytical mind processed the enormous flow of data differently than his more experienced colleagues. Where they saw immediate threats requiring immediate responses, He began recognizing deeper patterns that suggested the current attacks were merely preparation for something much larger. At 0347 hours, every screen in the facility simultaneously flashed red. The coordinated cyber assault that intelligence analysts had been predicting launched with devastating precision. Within seconds, critical infrastructure across multiple continents came under simultaneous attack. Power grids in Eastern Europe began experiencing cascading failures. Communication networks serving military installations went dark. Financial systems in major capitals started showing signs of manipulation. Air traffic control systems began receiving conflicting data that threatened civilian aviation safety. All hands, battle stations. Colonel Mitchell's voice echoed through the facility. This is not a drill. We are under coordinated cyber assault from multiple hostile actors. The main display showed a global map that looked like it was hemorrhaging red indicators. Attack vectors were multiplying faster than defensive systems could respond. Each successful penetration provided attackers with new access points for launching additional assaults. Daniel watched from his corner workstation as the facility's most experienced cyber warriors implemented emergency protocols. Firewalls were reinforced, backup systems were activated, and isolation procedures were initiated to prevent further penetration of critical networks. But the attackers had learned from months of reconnaissance. Every defensive measure was met with adaptive countermeasures that suggested intimate knowledge of NATO's cyber defense capabilities. Systems that should have been impenetrable were being compromised with surgical precision. "Sir, we're losing the power grid in Poland," reported Sergeant Rodriguez. "They've penetrated the control systems and are causing deliberate overloads. Communication with the Baltic states is intermittent," added Specialist Anderson. "They're jamming our emergency frequencies while simultaneously attacking our backup communication networks." Staff Sergeant Williams coordinated multiple response teams while trying to maintain overall situational awareness. Focus on critical infrastructure first. Military communications, power generation, and air traffic control take priority over everything else. Daniel's assigned sector included monitoring backup communication systems, but he found his attention drawn to broader patterns emerging from the chaos. While his colleagues focused on immediate defensive responses, he began tracking the mathematical progression underlying the attack's timing and target selection. The attacks weren't random despite their apparent chaos. There was an underlying algorithm governing which systems were targeted and in what sequence. Daniel realized the attackers were systematically dismantling NATO's defensive capabilities in a specific order designed to maximize confusion while minimizing the effectiveness of coordinated responses. "Sergeant Williams," Daniel called out, his voice barely audible above the controlled chaos. "I think I'm seeing an overall pattern in their target selection." "Not now, Chun," Williams replied curtly. "Focus on your assigned systems." But Daniel continued analyzing the broader attack patterns while maintaining his assigned monitoring duties. The mathematical progression became clearer as more data accumulated. The attackers were following a specific sequence designed to isolate and overwhelm defensive capabilities in a predetermined order. The facility's emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the faces of cyber warriors working frantically to contain the assault. Banks of servers hummed at maximum capacity as automated defensive systems engaged targets faster than human operators could track. Colonel Mitchell moved between workstations, gathering situational reports while coordinating with NATO headquarters and partner agencies. The scope of the attack was unprecedented, but its sophistication suggested years of preparation by highly organized adversaries. "Ma'am," reported a senior analyst, "we're detecting attack signatures consistent with at least 4 different state-sponsored groups operating in coordination. This represents a new level of international cyber cooperation among hostile actors." As dawn approached, the attack's intensity continued escalating. What had begun as infrastructure probing had evolved into systematic dismantling of Western defensive capabilities. Air defense systems were being compromised, leaving entire regions vulnerable to conventional military assault. Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cyber attack wasn't just designed to damage infrastructure, it was clearing the way for something much worse. The pattern of system failures was creating corridors of vulnerability that could be exploited by conventional military forces. While alarms continued blaring and his colleagues fought to contain individual attack vectors, Daniel pulled up a global projection displaying all compromised systems. The pattern that had been forming in his mind suddenly became crystal clear on the visual display. The cyber attacks weren't random acts of digital terrorism. They were systematically creating gaps in NATO's integrated defense network, gaps that aligned perfectly with known flight paths for intercontinental ballistic missiles from hostile nations. "Sir," Daniel called out urgently to Staff Sergeant Williams. "I need to show you something critical." "Chun, whatever it is can wait," Williams replied without looking up from his crisis management duties. "We're trying to prevent total system collapse here." But Daniel had moved beyond his assigned workstation and was approaching the central command area where Colonel Mitchell was coordinating the overall response. His usual deference was replaced by urgent determination. "Colonel Mitchell, ma'am," Daniel interrupted, knowing he was violating protocol but sensing the critical importance of his discovery. "The cyber attack is creating a coordinated vulnerability pattern that matches ICBM flight corridors from known hostile launch sites." Mitchell looked up sharply, her experienced eyes immediately grasping the implications. "Show me." Daniel quickly transferred his analysis to the main display screen, overlaying the pattern of compromised defensive systems with known missile flight paths. The correlation was undeniable and terrifying. "They're not just attacking our infrastructure," Daniel explained rapidly. "They're systematically dismantling our missile defense network in a sequence that creates temporary corridors of vulnerability. This isn't cyber warfare, it's preparation for nuclear strike." The command center fell silent except for the continuing alarm sounds. Every person present understood the catastrophic implications of Daniel's analysis. If his assessment was correct, they had minutes or at most hours before the cyber attack transitioned into something unthinkably worse. Colonel Mitchell immediately activated emergency communication protocols with NATO headquarters and strategic command authorities. "This is Cyber Defense Command Norfolk with Priority Alpha Intelligence. We have evidence suggesting ongoing cyber assault is preparation for coordinated nuclear strike." While senior officials absorbed this information, Daniel continued refining his analysis. The mathematical precision of the attack sequence allowed him to predict which systems would be targeted next and approximately when those attacks would occur. Based on the progression pattern, Daniel reported, they'll target the Greenland early warning radar in approximately 17 minutes, followed by the satellite communication relay stations in Scotland and Norway within the following hour. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had initially dismissed Daniel's concerns, now watched the young soldier's analysis with growing respect and alarm. "Chun, are you certain about these timing predictions? The pattern has been mathematically consistent for the past 6 hours, Daniel replied. "Unless they deviate from their established algorithm, the sequence is predictable." Colonel Mitchell was simultaneously coordinating with multiple command authorities while monitoring Daniel's ongoing analysis. Emergency protocols were being activated across NATO's integrated defense network based on the intelligence provided by their youngest cyber specialist. "Private Chen," Mitchell said formally, "I'm officially designating you as senior analyst for this crisis. Your pattern recognition capabilities exceed anything we've seen from our most experienced personnel." The transformation was remarkable. Daniel, who had been relegated to routine maintenance tasks just hours earlier, was now directing the most critical cyber defense operation in NATO's history. His quiet competence had become the foundation for preventing potential nuclear catastrophe. With Daniel's predictions proving accurate, the facility shifted from reactive crisis management to proactive defense. They now knew which systems would be targeted and approximately when those attacks would occur, allowing them to preposition defensive resources. "Greenland Radar Station, this is Norfolk Cyber Command," Daniel transmitted directly to the threatened installation. "You will be under sophisticated cyber assault beginning in approximately 12 minutes. Implement Protocol 7 defensive measures immediately." Similar warnings went out to installations across the NATO network as Daniel's analysis identified upcoming targets. For the first time since the crisis began, they were getting ahead of the attackers instead of merely responding to damage already inflicted. But Daniel realized something even more disturbing as he refined his mathematical models. The cyber attack sequence was designed to create maximum vulnerability at a specific time 0800 hours Central European Time, which was less than 2 hours away. "Colonel," Daniel reported urgently, "the entire attack sequence is building toward a specific moment of maximum defensive vulnerability. At 0800 CET, their systematic compromising of our networks will create a window where multiple missile defense systems will be simultaneously offline for routine maintenance cycles they've triggered." Mitchell immediately grasped the implications. How long would this vulnerability window remain open? Daniel ran rapid calculations on his workstation. Based on automatic system recovery protocols, approximately 14 minutes. Long enough for a coordinated nuclear strike to penetrate our defenses before backup systems could engage. The facility's atmosphere shifted from urgent crisis management to desperate race against time. Every person present understood they were potentially the only thing standing between routine cyber attack and nuclear holocaust. Emergency communications flooded in from the highest levels of NATO command structure. The President of the United States was being briefed in real time. Military forces worldwide were being placed on maximum alert. But the key to preventing catastrophe lay in the hands of a 19-year-old soldier, whom everyone had dismissed as just the computer kid. "Daniel," Colonel Mitchell said, using his first name for the first time, "what do we need to do to prevent this vulnerability window from opening?" Daniel studied the attack patterns with intense concentration. The mathematical precision that allowed him to predict the attacks also revealed potential countermeasures. "We need to disrupt their timing by forcing them to respond to unexpected defensive measures. If we can make them deviate from their established algorithm, we can prevent the vulnerability window from opening on schedule." "What kind of defensive measures?" "We need to sacrifice some of our less critical systems intentionally, making it appear they've achieved certain objectives ahead of schedule. This will force them to accelerate their timeline, which should cause errors in their coordination." It was a desperate strategy that required precise timing and enormous risk. If Daniel's analysis was wrong, they would be voluntarily compromising defensive systems that might be needed for protection against the very attack they were trying to prevent. Staff Sergeant Williams coordinated the implementation of Daniel's strategy, while Colonel Mitchell maintained communication with command authorities. The young soldier had effectively become the architect of NATO's response to its greatest existential threat, AT-0730 hours. With only 30 minutes remaining before the predicted vulnerability window, Daniel made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden within the attack algorithm was a kill switch, a single command that could shut down the entire coordinated cyber assault instantaneously. But activating the kill switch required accessing the attacker's own command and control systems, which were protected by security measures that even NATO's most sophisticated penetration tools couldn't breach. The digital fortress protecting the kill switch was impenetrable through conventional cyber warfare techniques. "There's another way," Daniel announced quietly, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. "But it requires using techniques that violate every protocol we've been trained to follow." Colonel Mitchell approached his workstation. "Explain." "I can create a feedback loop using their own attack vectors against them. Instead of trying to penetrate their defenses, I can turn their attacks into a digital mirror that reflects their commands back through their own systems. But it requires temporarily disabling our own defensive firewalls, leaving us completely vulnerable during the process." The implications were staggering. Daniel was proposing to deliberately expose NATO's entire cyber defense network in order to exploit a theoretical vulnerability in the attacker's systems. If his theory was wrong, or if the timing was imperfect, the result would be complete compromise of Western defensive capabilities. "How long would we be vulnerable?" Mitchell asked. "Approximately 90 seconds, Daniel replied. "That's how long it would take for the feedback loop to propagate through their entire network and activate the kill switch. 90 seconds of complete vulnerability while under the most sophisticated cyber attack in human history. The risk was almost unthinkable, but the alternative was potential nuclear war." Colonel Mitchell activated emergency communication with the highest levels of command authority. The decision to implement Daniel's desperate strategy required approval from the President of the United States and NATO's Supreme Commander. While waiting for authorization, Daniel continued refining his approach. The feedback loop technique was entirely theoretical, something he had developed during late-night programming sessions but never tested under real-world conditions. The mathematical foundation was sound, but practical implementation under crisis conditions introduced countless variables. Authorization granted. The first step required systematically disabling every defensive firewall protecting critical military systems. Warning lights flashed red across every workstation in the facility as security protocols reported catastrophic vulnerability. To outside observers, it appeared that NATO's cyber defenses were collapsing completely. All defensive systems are offline, reported Sergeant Rodriguez, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. We're completely exposed. But Daniel continued implementing his theoretical feedback loop, creating digital pathways that would redirect the attacker's own commands back through their networks. The process required perfect timing and flawless execution. Any error would result in total compromise of Western defensive capabilities. 60 seconds remaining, Colonel Mitchell announced, tracking the countdown on her watch. Attack vectors that had been probing NATO systems all night suddenly found completely undefended networks. Instead of gradually dismantling defenses as planned, hostile cyber warriors found themselves with immediate access to target systems they had expected to fight for hours to penetrate. Daniel watched his screens intently as attack traffic flooded through the deliberately opened pathways. The feedback loop was forming exactly as his mathematical models had predicted, but the practical implementation remained unproven under real-world conditions. 45 seconds. The attacker's command and control systems began receiving their own attack signatures reflected back through the digital mirrors Daniel had created. Confusion spread through hostile cyber networks as their sophisticated algorithms encountered responses they hadn't programmed for. 30 seconds. Warning alarms throughout the facility reached crescendo levels as every system reported maximum vulnerability. If Daniel's theory was wrong, NATO's entire cyber defense network would be completely compromised within minutes. But the feedback loop was propagating through hostile networks exactly as predicted. Attack commands were being turned against the systems that had generated them, creating cascading failures throughout the coordinated assault network. 15 seconds. Daniel's fingers hovered over the final command sequence. The kill switch was now theoretically accessible through the feedback loop pathways, but activating it required perfect timing. Too early, and the loop wouldn't be fully established. Too late, and the attackers might detect and counter the intrusion. 10 seconds. The mathematical progression that had governed the attack all night was now working in NATO's favor. Daniel's feedback loop had turned the attackers' precision against them, creating the exact vulnerability in their systems that they had been trying to create in Western defenses. 5 seconds. Daniel pressed the activation key. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Every attack vector simultaneously ceased. Hostile penetrations of critical infrastructure stopped mid-process. The coordinated cyber assault that had threatened nuclear war simply vanished as if it had never existed. Silence fell across the facility as alarm systems gradually shut down and warning indicators shifted from red to green. The kill switch had worked exactly as Daniel's mathematical models had predicted, shutting down the entire coordinated attack through the feedback loop he had created. Confirm all attack vectors have ceased, Colonel Mitchell ordered, her voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Confirmed. Reported stations throughout the facility. No hostile activity detected across all monitored networks. European theater reports complete cessation of cyber attacks, added Sergeant Rodriguez. Power grids, communication systems, and military networks are all reporting normal operational status. Daniel slowly removed his hands from the keyboard, his body trembling slightly from the accumulated stress of the past several hours. The young soldier who had been dismissed as just the computer kid had just prevented what could have been the most catastrophic attack in human history. Colonel Mitchell approached his workstation with an expression of profound respect. Private Chun, I want you to understand what you've accomplished here. Your pattern recognition and theoretical analysis capabilities exceeded anything we've seen from the most experienced cyber warfare specialists in NATO. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had initially relegated Daniel to routine maintenance tasks, stood at attention. Sir, I formally request that Private Chun be recommended for immediate promotion and assignment to our senior analyst position. But Daniel remained focused on his screens, continuing to monitor for any sign that the attack might resume. His analytical mind wouldn't allow him to assume complete success until all systems had been thoroughly verified. The kill switch worked exactly as modeled, Daniel reported quietly. But we need to conduct comprehensive security audits to ensure no hidden access points were established during their reconnaissance phase. Over the following hours, the full scope of what had been prevented became clear. Intelligence analysis revealed that the cyber attack had indeed been preparation for coordinated nuclear strikes targeting major NATO installations and population centers. Daniel's recognition of the attack pattern and his desperate countermeasure had literally prevented nuclear war. Emergency communication from the President of the United States arrived within hours, personally commending the young soldier whose theoretical mathematics had saved Western civilization. NATO headquarters formally requested Daniel's permanent assignment to their senior cyber warfare. The secure briefing room at NATO Cyber Defense Command had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Present were Colonel Mitchell, senior analysts from multiple agencies, and representatives from the highest levels of military command. At the center of attention sat Private First Class Daniel Chun, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "The mathematical analysis you provided," said General Richardson from NATO headquarters, "represented a level of pattern recognition that our most sophisticated artificial intelligence systems failed to detect. How did you identify the correlation between cyber attacks and missile defense vulnerabilities?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "The timing intervals weren't random, sir. They followed a mathematical progression that suggested optimization for a specific objective. When I overlaid the attack patterns with known defensive system maintenance cycles, the correlation became obvious." "Obvious to you," observed Colonel Mitchell. "Our senior analysts with decades of experience missed these patterns completely." The debriefing continued for hours as Daniel explained his analytical methodology to intelligence specialists who would incorporate his techniques into future defensive protocols. The feedback loop strategy that had saved NATO's networks was already being studied for implementation as a standard countermeasure. But Daniel's thoughts kept returning to the moment when he had pressed that final activation key. 90 seconds of complete vulnerability, with the fate of Western civilization hanging in the balance. The mathematical calculations had been perfect, but the human cost of being wrong would have been unthinkable. "Private Chen," General Richardson said formally, effective immediately, "you are promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant and assigned as Senior Analyst for NATO Cyber Defense Operations. Your salary will be adjusted accordingly, and you will receive the NATO Medal for Distinguished Service." The promotion represented a jump of 3 ranks, unprecedented in military history. But everyone present understood that Daniel's contribution had been equally unprecedented. "There's something else," added Colonel Mitchell. "We're establishing a new division focused on advanced pattern recognition and theoretical cyber warfare techniques. We want you to head that division and train other analysts in your methodologies." Daniel nodded acceptance, though part of him missed the quiet anonymity of his corner workstation. Recognition came with responsibility, and he understood that his analytical capabilities would now be focused on preventing future attacks of similar sophistication. 6 months later, the Advanced Pattern Recognition Division at NATO Cyber Defense Command had become the most sought-after assignment in military cyber warfare. Under Daniel's leadership, the division had identified and neutralized 17 major cyber threats before they could cause significant damage. The corner workstation where Daniel had spent his first 6 months was now occupied by another young analyst, someone whose quiet competence reminded senior personnel that exceptional abilities often came in unremarkable packages. Daniel's new office overlooked the main operations floor where dozens of analysts implemented the theoretical frameworks he had developed. The mathematical models that had saved NATO from nuclear attack were now standard tools for cyber defense operations worldwide. "Staff Sergeant Chun," Colonel Mitchell said, entering his office with a priority intelligence briefing. "We're detecting preliminary signs of another coordinated reconnaissance effort, possibly state-sponsored. The patterns are more sophisticated than anything we've seen before." Daniel reviewed the intelligence data, his analytical mind immediately identifying subtle signatures that suggested months of careful preparation. "This is different from the previous attack," he observed. "They've learned from our countermeasures and adapted their approach. Can you determine their ultimate objective?" Daniel pulled up advanced analysis tools, running deep investigations into the suspicious activity. The patterns were more complex than the attack he had neutralized 6 months earlier, but underlying mathematical progressions were still detectable. "Give me 6 hours," Daniel replied. "I need to map their reconnaissance patterns against known critical infrastructure vulnerabilities." As Colonel Mitchell left to coordinate preliminary defensive measures, Daniel settled into the analytical work that had become his specialty. The young soldier who had once been dismissed as just the computer kid was now NATO's first line of defense against the most sophisticated cyber threats facing Western civilization. His corner workstation had been replaced by an office full of advanced analytical equipment, but Daniel's greatest asset remained the same, an analytical mind capable of detecting patterns that others missed. In the complex mathematical relationships governing cyber warfare, he had found both his calling and his contribution to protecting the world from digital catastrophe. The button he had pressed 6 months earlier had changed everything, not just the outcome of a single crisis but the entire approach to cyber defense. And in the quiet moments between crises, Daniel continued refining the theoretical frameworks that might one day prevent the unthinkable from becoming reality. The young man who had sat silently in the corner, dismissed by colleagues who saw only his youth and inexperience, had become the architect of NATO's digital defense strategy. Sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities were hidden in the most ordinary appearances, waiting for the right moment to change the world. In the corner of his new office sat a small plaque with a simple inscription: "Pattern recognition saves lives." It served as a daily reminder that, in the mathematical precision of cyber warfare, the difference between catastrophe and survival often came down to recognizing what others had missed. The quiet soldier had found his voice, and the world was safer because of it.